Hey 7th graders, Mr. Chamberlain back with video lesson number 2 for the week of May 18th, 2020. So lesson number 1 was a little bit on the shorter side. I wanted to introduce to you the different countries of East and Southeast Asia, talk about their economies for a minute, and that there's a lot of poverty in some of the other nations. Even in some of the nations with good economies, there's a lot of poverty like China. Now for lesson number 2, this is kind of where I wanted to spend most of our time this week. We're going to start off talking about the physical features of East and Southeast Asia. So I'm going to put up on the screen here a physical map of the region. Let's start on the west side. If you look at that big orange spot there, that is an extension of the Himalaya mountains that we talked about in the South Asia unit, where Mount Everest is. That big spot is the world's largest plateau. It's called the Plateau of Tibet. That is also where many of the major rivers that begin, that flow through East and Southeast Asia begin. We'll be focusing on one of those rivers in a few minutes. Just to the north of the Plateau of Tibet is the Taklamakan Desert. This is a very harsh desert, and not a lot of people live in either one of those areas because of the harsh climate. So the Plateau of Tibet is known as the roof of the world, and the Taklamakan Desert, harsh climate. So all that stuff is in China, which has the world's largest population. And because of that, most of those almost 2 billion people that live in China live on the east side of China, because that's where the climate is more moderate and the best farmland is. There's another desert that spreads across Mongolia in China, known as the Gobi Desert. Some of the best farmland in China is found in the North China Plain and the Manchurian Plain. Japan, there's 4 major islands of Japan. That is known as an archipelago. The biggest island is Honshu, and on Honshu is their famous sacred mountain called Mount Fuji. Between China and Japan, you have the Korean Peninsula. This is where the countries of North and South Korea can be found. The dividing line between those two countries is the 38th parallel, which is 38 degrees north. And we will talk more about that dividing line next week when we talk about North Korea. There are several rivers that flow through East and Southeast Asia that are very significant. We have the Mekong River, the Huanghe River, and the one that we're going to talk about in the most detail, the Yangtze River. And we're going to come back to that in just a few moments. And then we have a lot of bodies of water that I want to talk about. So we have the Sea of Japan, or also known as the East Sea, if you live in Korea. That's oftentimes the area where Kim Jong-un will test nuclear weapons and other missiles. You have the East China Sea, and you have the Yellow Sea. And don't forget, much of this part of the world is also on the Ring of Fire. So Japan, for example, just north of Indonesia, that Ring of Fire that goes around the Pacific Ocean is located there. And so we have a lot of seismic activity, which means earthquakes and volcanoes. Matter of fact, Japan was made from volcanoes. All right, so our first main point of discussion for this particular lesson is going to be the Yangtze River. So the Yangtze River is the world's fastest flowing river, and it's actually the 3rd longest river in the world. And it flows across China and empties into right by the city of Shanghai, which is one of the world's largest cities and one of the world's most populated cities. Well, when the Yangtze River, because it's so fast flowing, would flood, there would be very destructive and deadly, and thousands of people had died in many different floods. And so China decided they were going to try and move into modernizing and being able to control the flooding and create the world's biggest power plant by building the world's largest dam, and it's called the Three Gorges Dam. Now, funny story about the Yangtze River, this is actually the river where you can find the city of Wuhan, which, if you have been following the COVID-19 story, is where many people believe it originated. At a fish market or a seafood market or a meat market there in the city of Wuhan. All right, so the Chinese government decided they were going to build this world's largest power plant. It's called the Three Gorges Dam, and it is a massive structure. So they built it in an area known as the Three Gorges, which are these like beautiful canyon-looking things. And when you remember, we've talked about this before, when you put a dam on a river, the water that flows behind that river is going to start collecting and forming a man-made lake behind it. If you remember the bachelor pad story that we talked about, the Nile River, that's called a reservoir. And the reservoir behind the Three Gorges Dam is the world's largest reservoir. Some scientists say that it's so big and heavy that it could even move the Earth off its axis a little bit, creating like the length of days to grow, I mean, microscopically, but and it's not proven, but there's some people that say that. Now, when building this big structure, which cost $25 billion to make, they had to weigh the pros and cons. So let's talk about the pros first. The first thing is that this particular dam is going to save lives because it's not going to allow flooding going down to the major populated cities like Shanghai anymore. Now they can control that flooding. So that's one positive aspect. The next aspect is that it has created the world's largest power plant. So this particular power plant creates the same amount of electricity as 18 nuclear power plants. Something like New York City, Washington, Philadelphia, and Boston. It can create enough electricity to power all of those cities, which is incredible. Now, the dam took over 10 years to build, and it is all complete now. And it has a lock system that you can get past it. It's increased travel into the region. It brings in a lot of tourists because it's like the world's largest dam. And you know, it's increased trade because ships can go safer, deeper inland, and it's made cities like Chongqing grow very rapidly as well. On the other hand, there's been some negative side effects. So first thing is when you build that dam and the reservoir grows and gets larger, people were forced from their homes. They estimate that somewhere between 1 and 2 million people were told to leave their homes. So basically they got a letter from the government. The government actually went through cities and they put a line on walls saying that this is where the level is going to be when the dam is complete. You have to leave. And they'd make people knock down their own houses brick by brick before they could leave. Now the government did build new houses for them. They're like built up on the hillsides, so they're not in the flooded areas. And they're government-owned homes. They would have running water and electricity, which they may not have had before. But a lot of these people that live along the Yangtze River Valley, their families had lived in the same homes for hundreds of years. There's stories about, you know, a lady whose family had lived in the same house for 400 years. So think about all their memories are gone. One thing that's important to the Chinese people is going to visit ancestors' grave sites. Well, all those graves are now underwater. There's also an ancient civilization that lived along the Yangtze, and they have lots of like archaeological digs along the river. And they would find ancient artifacts all the time, but now those are going to be under 30, 40 feet of water, never to be found again. So there's a lot of negative aspects to the Three Gorges Dam. Now you are going to watch an Edpuzzle. And normally I have a really long video. I would show you a documentary about the Three Gorges Dam, but being in the situation that it is, it's a shortened form of the video. It's just a few minutes long, have you answer a few questions, and gives you kind of a good visual representation of what the Three Gorges Dam is all about. Okay, so our last topic for today is going to be China's population. So China has the world's largest population. Back after they became a communist country, they were led by a dictator by the name of Mao Zedong. Now, Mao Zedong encouraged people to have large families because he thought it would bring economic success to China. However, due to some failed farm policies and such a fast-growing population, China started to run out of food. They couldn't find enough jobs for everybody or enough housing for everybody, and with the population that large, there's a lot of scarcity with those type of things. So after Mao Zedong died, his predecessor decided to change things up a little bit from the strategy of having large families, and they decided to require people to only have one kid per family, and they called this the one-child policy. Now think about the government being able to tell you how many kids you can have. It's a lot different than what we're used to here in the United States with a lot of freedom, but under communist governments you lack a lot of freedoms, and that's just one example of it. Now the one-child policy did not apply to everybody. It only applied to one group of people called the Han. That's an ethnic group in China, but that is the majority of the people. Like 90 to 91% of the people who live in China are the Han ethnic group. But if you or I were to move to China for business, or we wanted to live there, it would not have applied to us because we're not the Han ethnic group. It also only applied to people living in urban areas or cities. If you lived into a farm, you could ask for permission to have larger families because you're going to need that extra help to work on your farm. Now, they would readjust and reassess the one-child policy about every 5 years, and eventually they allowed it to skip generations. So if you were a one-child and you didn't have any siblings, you were allowed to have 2 kids with permission. And back in 2016, they basically made it a 2-child policy. So now families, because their population was actually shrinking, and they're not going to have enough young people to kind of work and help take care of the old population, they are now allowing families to have 2 kids per family. So that one-child policy has now become a 2-child policy. Now, there's been a lot of side effects to this policy. One thing is that in Chinese culture, it's preferred to have a boy. So when you are only allowed to have 1 child, and if you were to have a girl, a lot of these girls were becoming abandoned, homeless, or ending up in orphanages. So hopefully the 2-child policy will help out with that. It's also led to kind of an unbalanced ratio between boys and girls in China. There are about 60 million more boys than girls in China, which, as you can imagine, would create some social unbalance as well, with people finding people to marry and have relationships with. Our last assignment this week is going to be another Ed puzzle from CNN 10. We're going to take a look at a story about the one-child policy and some of the side effects and maybe some things that were unplanned and how it's really impacting the elderly people of China today. All right, just to review. So we looked at the physical features of East and Southeast Asia. We talked about the Three Gorges Dam. You're going to get more information in the form of an article and an Ed puzzle to check out. The Ed puzzle is not very long and just has a few questions. Then we talked about the population in China being the world's largest and that they put a policy in place to slow down the growth, which was called the one-child policy, which has recently changed to the 2-child policy. You're going to watch a CNN 10 Ed puzzle about that and how it has affected the elderly people in China. For both lessons this week, I've included a Google Slides presentation just for you to take a look at. It has a little bit more detailed information about some of the subjects that we talked about, just to kind of build up your knowledge on this part of the world. Make sure you check out office hours, Monday 2 o'clock, Friday 10 o'clock. Have a great week, guys.